Hello. Welcome to our live stream broadcast. I always never know if we should call this a webinar or live podcast recording or, YouTube video stream because our goal is to get information out there. And it's so great to be live today with all of you and to have our partners from Citizen on the call with us today. So I would just like to welcome everybody who is joining us for this live stream as we talk about Clinical Trials 101. And I want to emphasize the one-on-one because I by no means am an expert, but we are here to bring experts with us to answer some of the pertinent questions that we've been hearing around clinical trials. So I'm Laura Carfing, the Executive Director of SurvivingBreastCancer.org. It is my pleasure today to be speaking with Martin Naley from Citizen, who is kind of the program lead for clinical trials. You have an amazing background, having worked for the Biden Cancer Institute before and have over a decade of experience working in clinical trials. So it's just an honor to be speaking with you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
It's a privilege to be here.
Excellent. And for all of you who are watching as well, what you can expect from today's conversation is that we're going to do some high-level, just general conversations about what clinical trials are, and then also get into the weeds because, that's really what we want to figure out: how to get involved, who's eligible, what we need to know, the questions to ask, and how you can actually take action by the end of this call feeling empowered and knowing where to go with that. I'm also joined with a couple of panelists who I will be introducing momentarily as well. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat on whatever platform you're watching. And for those of you who RSVP'd, I did get your plethora of questions as well, and we'll try and weave that in throughout the conversation today. But without further ado, Martin, I hear the conversation about clinical trials a lot. It's actually one of the questions I get in my inbox all the time, except that I feel like it stops right there, right? It's like, I'm interested, I've heard about it, but I don't really know what they are. Can we just how would you define a clinical trial? What is it that the patient who's investigating, and we hear these terms, what is it that they need to know about what a clinical trial actually is?
Yeah, clinical trials are something that every patient should be thinking about at every step of their care. The nature of cancer is that it's full of big decision moments. And when you hit one of those decision moments, what's the next line of therapy to go for? You have to be thinking almost like a chess game, the next two steps ahead. What are you qualified for today to have in your care? What could you be qualified for tomorrow? What decisions can you make today to get yourself ready? And often people think about clinical trials as maybe the last thing you'd think about in your care. I like to think about it as the first thing you ought to be thinking about in your care. Trials for brand new drugs are typically, those drugs are introduced at the end of care, but then trials move forward in the care journey from the very end to second line to first line, all the way to the beginning of cancer. And so some of these new treatments become available to you really at the beginning stages of your cancer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think sometimes we have this misconception that clinical trials are only an option when all of the other options have exceeded, right? Or that we're on our final line of treatment and we need another resource. But what I'm hearing is that really, even on the earlier stages, these are initial conversations you can start having with your oncologist and with your medical care team about what options are available. And if you're, depending on the phase and stage that you're in, if you're eligible for any of them. Am I understanding that correct?
Yeah, and furthermore, if you don't consider a trial today, you might actually take on another line of care that prevents you from getting that trial tomorrow. So you need to be able to think about those trials as equal to standard of care options. They are, often considered therapeutic options today. That's really a change in the medical mindset, that it's not just research; it's an opportunity to get the best therapy. And so wherever you are in your care, when you hit one of those decision moments, is when you ought to be talking with your oncologist and exploring every opportunity you have.
That's a really good point. And actually, we did get one of those questions of, speaking of eligibility, right? And if you participate on a trial, what I think we're kind of going on in terms of this question is, would it preclude you from being eligible for other treatments later down the line, or even the reciprocal? If you started off with a Taxol or an AC treatment or something, would that preclude you from participating on a clinical trial? How do we find out that information, and with whom should we be speaking to?
Yeah, so the information is available in a public place. It's just impossible to read it there. It's unfortunate. So there is a place called clinicaltrials.gov online. All clinical trial sponsors are required to register their trials there. You can think of it like the trials phone book. But it's written in a language that nobody understands. Even oncologists have difficulty understanding it. I often say it's written as riddles. And so not only are they riddles, but they're riddles in a foreign language, which, they kind of lose their meaning and even lose their humor. And so the challenge, I think, and this is what I've been working at for the last decade, is to bridge essentially a language gap between what's found in a patient's medical records and the language that's spoken in, which is medical terminology, and clinical trial selection criteria, which is a completely different terminology, using similar related words but not the same words. And so, for instance, your Taxol question, there are many different drugs that are called that have their own names: paclitaxel, Abraxane, whatever, that are all taxanes. And this is just one random example. A clinical trial may require that a patient has had a certain number of taxane treatments. So getting that round of that next treatment of Taxol or whatever could be the thing that qualifies you for a certain trial. But at the same time, if you've already had a line of taxane therapy, and a trial has a limit of patients can only have had one before, then you could actually exclude yourself from that trial by accident. And so that's why it's important to have the list of trials that are either available to you now or could be available to you soon, so that you can start making those decisions together with your oncologist. It's almost impossible to do that research on your own. And that's the work I've been doing, is to deliver essentially reports, lists of trials to patients that they're eligible for today or that they have a qualification path to get to for tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. So it's almost like getting as much information as you can upfront so that you can make informed decisions about your overall life cycle plan, not just in the immediate. And I know so many of us who are listening and going through this, we are forced in a very short period of time to make these critical decisions because the cancer is aggressive or growing, or we got diagnosed at a particular stage, that we don't have a lot of time necessarily to do the investigative research or even to know that this is an option for us. So I really appreciate you bringing that to light.
Yeah, these decision moments are kind of, oh my gosh, moments, where everything is brought into focus in that moment. And unfortunately, the research that you have to do to find your treatment options takes a bit of time. And so having the luxury of a report that gives you that information can really help in those discussions with your doctor. What you don't want to have happen is that the information gets to you after you've had the interaction with your doctor and made a decision. It's just too late. So it's important to make that request, get your trial options report as soon as you can.
Yeah. So speaking of this trial options report, can you explain how someone would go about getting that? What is that?
Yeah. So a little bit about me. So I'm a biologist with a business background. And I worked in a company that helped to bring genomics into the world. It was a company called Invitrogen, became Life Technologies. And working with that company, I had a chance to develop and introduce some of the first genomic sequencing tests for cancer. And I was really excited about them. I definitely got some religion about that technology, but I was disappointed and impatient about the uptake of that technology in the world. So I started a company. It was called Cure Forward. That company doesn't exist today. what it did was help patients get genomic sequencing tests and gather their health information, and then use that information to get into clinical trials. In doing so, I kind of learned this language gap, and I also learned what investigators, the people who run trials, need to see for a patient in order to make that patient qualified for the trial. And I learned about how difficult that is. There are a lot of places out there where you can kind of get superficial clinical trial matching. And so sometimes those places ask you a few questions online, what your cancer type is and so on. Some of the questions, if they wanted to go deeper, get too hard to answer for a patient, so they don't. And so you wind up with kind of superficial matches. And so I decided to make something that would be a lot more rigorous, and at the risk actually of being almost impenetrable to most users. The hard part is actually making it understandable, which is a set of matches based on every aspect of your medical records that would qualify you for the selection criteria in clinical trials. And so I started doing that when I was at Cure Forward, and Cure Forward stopped. And from there, I've had a chance to work with a number of different companies and organizations like the Biden Cancer Initiative to solve this problem. And unfortunately, it just hasn't been solved yet. And I was really lucky to meet the founder of Citizen, who was bold enough to take a chance on this project. What's really distinct about this project is that I made no compromises. The world is full of compromises on clinical trial matching. And an example of a compromise is you might go to an institution that has a wonderful set of trials available within the walls of that institution, but it's never going to be all the trials. Even if you're at one of those elite academic medical centers in one of the cities with the best doctors, there could be another trial down the road that you don't know about. And so the compromise could be the breadth of trials that's available to you, or it could be the depth of matching. And I decided to take neither of those compromises. And this guy, Anil, gave me a chance to do that. So what we do through software is take all of your medical record information and compare it to all the clinical trials and deliver you a report. It's just a list grouped by the degree of match strength and the location matches to your travel preferences. And so, within that report, you see first the highest level matches within your location choices. And then last, you see kind of the partial matches outside of your location choices and everything in between. And so that's what you get. And it's available now. Like, it's my dream that I worked at for a decade now, and I got a chance to make it with a company that really cares about making this possible for patients.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations. And I'm just so excited to hear about all of this coming together and how you really are not taking any compromises. You really are just going out there to create the best tool possible to help the patient and find that match, and to talk about the role that technology plays in our healthcare, in our health system. And I really appreciate that.
Cool. In technology land, there's a acronym that everybody uses called MVP. That's the minimum viable product. What's the least you can get away with and get on the market? Well, unfortunately, in clinical trial matching, the MVP is everything. and that's just what we had to do. There's nothing, if you did anything else, you're delivering superficial matching, and the consequence of that is a patient getting hopeful and organizing their care around something that doesn't exist, and then meeting that investigator and the investigator having to give that patient bad news that they're not actually eligible for the trial. It's terrible for everyone. It's bad for the patient, bad for the investigator. Yeah. And what happens is the world gets jaded. And then everybody stops the doctors stop looking for trials, the patients stop looking for trials, the investigators stop taking the referrals. They just don't pick up the phone. And so the MVP is you have to do it perfectly to overcome this fatigue that the world feels so that people can actually believe again. That's what we're after.
Wonderful. It sounds like you're on the right pathway. And before I bring our panelists on to join our conversation, one last terminology question I have for you. So as people are getting their matching based on their medical records and they're getting this report of what trials they're available to, does your report also break it down based on like phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trials? And then specifically, how are those trials differentiated? Can you explain a little bit what the difference is between a phase 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah, so I'll take those in order. The first question, the answer is yes. Within each of those 4 trial groupings about match strength and location, the sort order is by phase descending. So you see the phase 3 trials first, down to the phase 2, and then what? So the reason that we show them all that way is phase 3 isn't necessarily better. Sure, those drugs are a little bit more validated, or those treatments. It's not all drugs these days. However, there are advantages to phase 1 trials too. There's no control arm. Some patients prefer that. They want a sure access to a new thing, even if it's a less proven thing. We don't have an opinion about what's better or worse, so we show them all and give people a chance. Now, in that, I kind of started to answer your second half of your question, which is what's a phase 1, 2, or 3. Phase 1 trials are where drugs are first introduced and tested for safety, drugs or other therapies. And so in the phase 1 trial, people are trying to figure out what's the right dose, what's the safe dose. And they start getting an initial read of efficacy at that point. But the trials aren't designed for efficacy testing, they're designed for safety testing. Phase 2 is more efficacy-based testing. It's a broader group of patients. It's expanding that dose to more people to see how that affects cancer. When they start getting some data in phase 2 that indicates the drug is really working, then they go into what's called a registration trial. Phase 3 trials are where you're trying to get the drug FDA approved. And so those are much bigger trials. It's much more defined patient cohorts, and the outcomes are much more statistically measured.
Thank you. Thanks for defining all of that for us so we have some terminology to use and describe. And one term also, you mentioned the control arm. So in these phase 1 trials, am I understanding it correctly that everyone who participates in that trial is a recipient of that drug or therapy? There is no placebo or alternative arm. It's just everyone gets that.
That's true. But I want to temper that. In phase 3s, there's no placebo. It's the best standard of care. And it's really important to know that. So it would be so unethical to put a cancer patient on something that won't help them. And so now these trials are absolutely done, for patients. They want to help patients while they're advancing these new treatments. And that's why I've always believed, and I learned this from a mentor a long time ago, research medicine is the best medicine. Because there's a chance you're going to get the new thing. But even if you don't get the new thing, you're still going to get the best care. And that's why people who go on clinical trials live longer. Statistically, there's great research out there that shows 1-year survival and 5-year survival statistically improves just by getting into a trial, not necessarily even getting the new thing.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. Well, I would like to welcome Abigail, Allison, and Sheila to the conversation. And all 3 of you have amazing, beautiful stories. So I will give you a chance to introduce yourself, but I'll try and do a little bit of a brief intro so that way our viewers and listeners know who we have here. So all of you are living with metastatic breast cancer, and you've come to it in different phases, which I think is really great. One of the questions that we had from one of the people who have RSVP'd to attend this today actually asked, she started off being an ER positive breast cancer patient and then ended up with triple negative breast cancer. And she was shocked to see that these subtypes can actually change and wanted to know if that was even possible. So I am looking at you, Allison, who has had that exact experience where you were diagnosed in around 2007 with ER positive breast cancer, had phenomenal response to all of your therapies, and then 10 years later had a recurrence where it came back metastatic and also triple negative, correct?
Yes, that is what happened to me, and I was completely floored because I didn't know that could happen.
Yeah.
And it was, let's just say it was extra upsetting at the time because it was bad enough
Yeah.
as it was.
I can imagine.
Um, but yeah, so that's been my situation. I've been living with metastatic triple negative now for um, almost 2.5 years, and I've had my ups and downs, as I think we all have. I've been on many lines of therapy. In fact, I've sort of lost count. I'd have to go back and see if it was 5 or 6. I'd have to really think that through. And I've been on some of the more novel therapies. I've been on the more traditional therapies. But overall, I'm doing pretty well. Luckily, nothing's in my organs, so that's really lucky. I've had a hell of a time with my neck. Um, I don't think I'll ever think of the expression pain in the neck in the same way. I don't think I'll ever call anyone that. Like my son, when he's being bad, I don't think I'll call him that. Because that's been where my cancer likes to hang out and cause me trouble.
Understood.
As far as clinical trials, I personally haven't had the experience yet of participating in one, but of course realize the importance, and I've I was in consideration for one. I went pretty far down the line. It was pretty much the same story that Martin was alluding to, where I was out to dinner with some friends, and I thought I qualified, and then I got the call saying I didn't, and it was based on medical minutia that even my doctor thought was minutia. But I'm hopeful that I'll find opportunities in the future for clinical trials.
I can see how that would be very challenging and hard to receive that news, let alone a
Yeah,
diagnosis and a recurrence. And then when you think you're so close to being a beneficiary of being on a trial, to realize that there's these small little things that still can qualify.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, well, I'm sorry that you had to go through that experience, and I will circle back with you because I know you did have some experiences too, trying to work through collecting all of your medical records and all of your data,
Yeah,
which is such an important piece. So I'll get back to that comment. But I
good.
also want to welcome Sheila for joining us today as well. It's lovely to have you on our live stream, and you have a wonderful story as well. And congratulations, I want to say, and thank you for your service of 25 years in the Air Force. That's
Thank you.
incredible. And you discovered your lump when you were in the Air Force.
Yes, I was active duty military back in 2009, and I discovered my backstory. My mom died of metastatic breast cancer in 2004, and 5 years later I got it. So I was diagnosed metastatic. I sneezed and didn't know what it was, and it was breast cancer that had spread to my liver and ribs. So I've been living with it for 11 years.
11 years. That's phenomenal.
So
And how scary too, like when I was reading your story, when you sneeze and feel this pain in your chest, right? Like you don't immediately think cancer, you would think allergies, right? Like why are you sneezing?
no, I just
Is
thought
that
it was like a weird feeling. It burned. And I'm like, that's weird. And I thought it was my breast. I'm like, well, I had my mammogram, and And I've been getting mammograms since I was 37 because my mom died when I was 37. And I was just like, that's weird. And then I sneezed again like a week later, and I was like, no. So I went to my military doctor, and I was just like, every time I sneeze, it burns. So they did a mammogram, and he brought me in, and he showed me. He said, "You see that white stuff on your breast?" He like literally showed me. He said, "That's breast cancer." He said, "What you were feeling was the cancer had was pressing onto your ribs." So that's the burning feeling I was feeling. Yeah, but who like I'm 43 years old, having fun, enjoying life, and who would have thought 43 years old? I didn't even know I didn't even know black women could get breast cancer except my mom. Because you look at the commercial and you don't see, back then you didn't see black women with breast cancer. So I'm like, breast cancer? You know, the only person I knew was my mom. And then when they said it, I was just like, wow. So I had to retire from the military and take care of myself. So
Absolutely. Well, and I appreciate you sharing your story too and letting,
thank you for inviting me.
of course, and to, I think, be a voice and let people know that, yes, breast cancer can happen to anybody at any age. And, you know, that there are options out there. And I know we'll talk a little bit too about the clinical trial experience. So thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
And Abigail, it's wonderful to have you back speaking with us. And
Thank you.
like, I know you so much, and then every time I read your story, there's something new too. But what I want to highlight about your story is that, you know, you were diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer and went through all of the typical treatments of surgery and chemotherapy, and within a short period of time discovered that it was metastatic and had spread to your bones. And the unique piece about this is that although your lymph nodes came back node negative, it actually traveled through the blood to your bones. And so I think that is a very educational piece too, to highlight that cancer has a mind of its own and will find its way to hibernate wherever it wants. And so when I'm glad that you found it. I think it was like through a routine like blood work of something like that, but then to go from 2 to 4 again, it's just always so shocking.
It was incredibly shocking. So it was actually a medical mistake that when I went for my first dose of chemo, the nurse checked the box to check my tumor markers. And so yes, in the middle of chemo, thinking I was stage 2, found out that I had actually been stage 4 from the beginning, and the tumors in my legs were actually substantially larger than the tumors in my breast had ever been. So that was why I was limping, and I was one bad step away from both of my femurs shattering. So it was a huge shock, and rushed into emergency surgery within days of discovering that I was stage 4. So now I have lots of metal in my body. I have rods in both femurs. So still waiting for the what's the superhero where you can like shoot out metal from your hands? Still waiting for that piece, as well as the superpowers from all the radiation. You know, got to have some silver linings to all of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one question that I want to follow up on is, you know, we've been talking a lot about clinical trials, and Martin gave us a great overview of matching and how to find them in this amazing report. But I wanted to ask if anyone, to direct it to anyone who wants to take the first question. How did you first decide like that this data piece was really important, that we needed to have a centralized place for medical records, that you could feel empowered to then send it out to places, to medical fields, to doctors, and then that you wanted to start investigating, or at least probing, whether you got accepted onto a clinical trial or not, that clinical trials were something on the horizon for you?
Well, I can take the first piece. So I moved in the middle of my treatment from one city to another. And I physically gathered all of my records. Like I literally had 4 binders full of paper and CDs. I mean, that's the way that I thought about things. And my background is as a lawyer. And so I would always have the paper and then 12 electronic backups, because I was always afraid of losing things. I also knew that medical records are typically kept 7 to 10 years. And so having the physical pieces of paper made me feel comfortable that the records would always be accessible. And it wasn't until I had done all of that work, that I found out about Citizen and the way that they gather the records for you, which would have saved me a whole lot of time running around trying to get information. So that was a huge effort. But then I also came into this thinking that clinical trials were for people who are about to die. Like, it was a Hail Mary last ditch effort. And when I came to my current medical oncologist, I was about 6 months in to my diagnosis, I signed up to participate in my first clinical trial, which was a method of genomic testing. So it was testing on my original tumor to find out if there were actionable mutations that had a treatment specific for it. And as a result of that trial, which was conducted at Memorial Sloan Kettering, I found out I had the PIK3CA mutation, which has led to my second line treatment, which I'm still on, which is Piqray. And so I learned early on, and I'm thankful I learned early on, that clinical trials are not just about taking medicine. And I'm sure Sheila will talk about her experiences of actually on an experimental treatment that has worked wonders for her. And I'm so happy about that. But that clinical trials are also about learning about how tests are run, or how a different technique. So I'm actually in a clinical trial right now that is looking at your blood work and circulating tumor DNA. And the idea is to be able to give doctors a leading indicator, and they think they're going to be able to tell doctors a year to 18 months in advance when cancer is progressing or mutating such that you're going to have a progression. So my experiences with clinical trials have all been about, take my data, take my blood, take my tissue, test it, and then give me information about it, which is, I think it definitely was something that I had not thought of in terms of participating in a clinical trial. So that's been a great experience. And I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second. As a lawyer, I'm always super, super, super interested in informed consent. I'm always super interested in the documents that people have to read. I'm always super interested in the justice piece of the people who really need the trials getting access to the trials. But I have a nonprofit, and through my nonprofit, I recruit lawyers. And one of the things I want to tell everybody who is listening, if you are getting into a clinical trial and you don't understand the paperwork, if you don't understand the consent, I will find a lawyer in your area to help you interpret that document, because everybody needs to understand 100% what they're signing. And I'm not saying that means that anybody's doing anything nefarious. It's just that these documents are often written in language that us lawyers use, and it's a whole jargon all its own, just like medical jargon. So, don't make the documents or not understanding what they are be a barrier to participating in a trial, because I'm happy to help with that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome.
And that was Connect for Legal Services. Is that excellent?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. So to segue from there, Sheila, what was your experience with clinical trials, and when did you know that you wanted to get involved?
Well, I had a fourth progression. I was on my sixth line of treatment, and my doctor said, "Well, it's progressing again." I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" So she said, "Well, you can go back on a standard one that's already approved treatment, or you can try this clinical trial." And I was like, "Sure." I said, my platform is clinical trials and getting Black women and men to participate in clinical trials. Considering the medical mistrust and the things, our history, our cultural differences. And I said, "Sure." So I've been on it since July of 2018. Like Abigail was saying about the informed consent and stuff, a lot of this stuff, it's just almost like this is not rocket science. Like, as far as the informed consent, make it an app, or make it something where I can understand it, or make it, even in the Black community, make it the transportation, or daycare, make it easier for people to participate in clinical trials. You know, when I'm on Twitter, somebody said, well, I have to pay for parking. Well, why do they have to pay for parking? And this is about, you know, it should be human centered. This is not so much about the minutes, but this should be human centered to where you make it easier for people to participate in clinical trials. You know, don't make it harder for me. It's already hard enough. You know, it wasn't a last resort. Um, I just decided, hey, if I'm gonna walk the walk, I'm gonna talk the talk. So I decided, you know, that's when I decided to participate. But you know, as far as medical records, you know, in the military, you get this stack of medical records. Like it's a stack when you retire, and it's just like, well, what am I gonna do with all this? So luckily for my hospital, you know, and I joined Citizen. You know, was talking to Sophia and Ricky Farley and Fairley, I'm sorry. And you know, it's like, well, why don't you try to get people, you know, involved in Citizens so all their medical records is just in one location, which is a good idea. Because if I want to see my scan, I want to see my scan. Or if I want
Exactly.
to see, you know, my you know, anything from 10 years ago, you know, or 5 years ago, I want to be able to just go on the computer and see it. I don't have to need all this paperwork. So I think it's all about education and just you know, we already have. What people don't understand too is from the Tuskegee Airmen, the IRB was formed. So there are so many, you know, guidelines now that, you know, I'm not saying forget it because we'll never forget it, but there are so many guidelines and protocols and stuff with clinical trials now that, you know, we're protected from things like the syphilis and the Tuskegee Airmen Project and Henrietta Lacks. So
Exactly. And I'm going to turn to Martin. I'm going to bring him back on to join us in this conversation as well, because this is a great segue to actually linger a little bit more on exactly what you were saying, Sheila, and informed consent, some of the ethics around clinical trials and the protections that the Institutional Review Board is going under and all of that. So, Martin, can you explain a little bit about what those best practices are to ensure the health and safety of people participating?
Sure, happy to. Before I go into that, I just want to pick up on something that was mentioned a moment ago about minority participation in clinical trials. You know, I found some numbers just recently. I was working on a project and came across these, and I found these numbers kind of staggering. So African Americans make up 12% of the U.S. population, but only 5% of the clinical trial population, which is, you know, it's definitely an underrepresentation. But then you look at Hispanic population, and that's 16% of the United States, but only 1% of clinical trial participants. 1%. So
Wow.
that tells you there's a lot of room for improvement. You know, overall, about 20 to 40% of patients could qualify for clinical trials. That's the estimate out there based on academic experts. I've actually found trials for just about every person who's come through our service. So it's probably higher than that 20 to 40%, but only 8% participate today. And that is, you know, then you look among ethnic subpopulations, and you know, white people just have, you know, a much better chance of participating in research than anybody else. And we, you know, any solution that comes to bear for clinical trial matching has to address that inequity, or it's not a solution. That's our point of view. Just wanted to get that out there. Regarding kind of protections, I think a lot of the protections exist today because of what was mentioned here by Tuskegee Airmen and so on. You know, there were poor protections in the past, and you know, exploitation really of different groups of people to do research, and that is unconscionable. You know, looking back on it, and so that's why these protections do exist. Every clinical trial is overseen by an investigational review board, which is part of a medical institution. Every institution has one, and then also there are investigational review boards that span multiple institutions, so that community hospitals can also offer research without having to develop their own IRBs. And so those IRBs meet and talk about a protocol, and they won't allow that protocol to happen at that institution unless safeguards are in place. Those safeguards are described in an informed consent document that's given to the patient. And like Abigail said, those can be really dense. So it's important to get some help sometimes to read through them. I do believe that they are written with the best intention to protect the patients who participate in research.
Yeah, thank you.
I would agree with that as a lawyer. I mean, I've drafted lots of documents where I understood what they said, but the layperson would not. So I wasn't casting aspersions on anybody's intentions there, just that us lawyers do speak in a different language. So it's important to know that. And it's important to know as a patient walking into it that nobody's trying to hide the ball, right? Nobody's trying to confuse you or make it more difficult. It's legitimately that words, everyday words that people use, oftentimes have a different definition in the legal context, but also everyday words often have a different definition in the medical context. So it legitimately is, you're just walking into somebody else's world in terms of language.
Absolutely. Just like cancer, it's a whole new language. It's crazy. Here you are sick and you have to learn a new language. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Sheila.
We had this discussion on Twitter the other day where it said, are you going to call me a subject or a patient? Do I look like a subject? No, I don't look like a subject. I look like a patient. Don't call me a subject. But then that's another thing, a race, cultural difference, or experimental drug. We're already thinking that, we're going into this as guinea pig. No, we're patients. Patients matter. Call us patients. I don't want to be called a subject
or maybe even a person.
Here comes the subject. It's like, no, I'm a patient. That's clinical trial.
Right.
I wanted to jump in and talk about my experience when I came very close. And I mentioned earlier that I thought I was going to enroll and I didn't. But I wanted to sort of recount what it was like to go and learn about the trial. So basically, I went to the office of a trial coordinator, and there was a couple of nurses who focused on trials who were walking me through the study design, and it was very, very, very complicated to understand. Now I have a PhD, not in science but in literature. I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 15 years, and I had difficulty understanding what they were talking about with the study design. And my husband looked at me and he whispered in my ear. And my husband's a Yale graduate. He whispered in my ear. He said, "What the hell is a wild type?" So there's really the way trials are. There's a long way to go, and describing trials in a way that makes sense to people. I could have easily run the other way. There were no handouts about how to, what is a trial, what's the terminology. They literally gave me a copy of the study design that the scientists use. So frankly, it was a bit appalling the way information is communicated to patients, and something I really feel passionate about, just bringing that to light for a few reasons. One, if you're in that situation and you're considering a trial and you have no idea what they're talking about, just realize you're not alone, because most patients don't have any idea. So that's sort of some comfort for patients out there if you don't understand. And two, for clinicians, you guys need to do a better job of taking things down and explaining them. That's a big piece of why people don't enroll, because They don't know what a wild type is or anything else. So,
Totally. And nowhere in your medical record would it ever say that you're wild type. You know,
yeah,
it would be the absence of information. You just wouldn't have a mutation
yeah,
in that gene reported. And so that's what makes it impossible. These patients in trials are desperate for each other. You know? And yet they're just ships in the night, because the trials are out there, saying, hey, come on down if you're a wild type, and nobody knows if you're a wild type.
yeah.
Right. It seems like we could do a lot to kind of bring the groups together, which is what we're doing, right? It's
Yeah.
all of these constituents, and maybe even it's part of the IRB process or the recruitment process of meeting with the patients to say, does this actually make sense? I know I'm the primary investigator, but what questions do you have that we can have this out of this FAQ sheet that we give to people in advance and really start moving the needle that way? So we talked a lot about your experience collecting the data piece and then participating in the long, arduous process of becoming on clinical trials. Martin, it sounds like what you're doing at Citizen is really trying to alleviate some of these pain points. Can you talk a little bit about what your process is like for collecting the medical records and the matching, and what can a patient expect, not the subject, but the patient expect when they reach out to Citizen to get more information and get involved?
Sure. It's all designed to be a 60-second process. And it's online. You just go to the Citizen website and sign up. You can do it on your phone. You take a picture of your driver's license, and then Citizen uses basically your sign-up form with your ID to go to every place that you've had medical care and make that request on your behalf. It's your legal right to get your data. And so Citizen just helps you exercise that right, which is afforded to you under HIPAA. A lot of people talk about HIPAA as kind of a blocker in healthcare. It's actually not intended to do that at all. The P in HIPAA is not privacy, it's portability. And the idea is to make your data available to you where you want it. And so we go ahead and make those requests. Institutions typically deliver those medical records to us in giant PDF documents, just like what you talked about, Sheila, the 1,000-page binder of your medical records. I've worked with a lot of companies who have tried to argue that data should be more interoperable or operable, and try to fight the system. One of the things we realized at Citizen is just wasn't worth it. You're not going to change the system everywhere. There's a lot of incumbency in healthcare, and so we said, fine, give us those 1,000-page, 3,000-page PDFs. We'll learn how to read them. And so what we did is made a machine learning process. Machine learning is a fancy language, but basically what it means is you start a machine, and the machine is wrong all the time, like all the time. All right, and you start feeding documents into the machine, and you just start telling it that it's wrong. It's like, nope, that's not right. And then every now and then the machine makes a lucky guess. And you say, you pat the machine on the head and say, good job. And you verify that lucky guess was right. And now the machine has learned, okay, when I see this, I can, I want to get that from the documents, or I want to note it this way. What Citizen has done is made it possible to take that 3,000, 1,000, however long page PDF and pull out the information that's important for your cancer care, just the most vital elements. And the machine, through its machine learning, has gotten to a very high accuracy point where it's almost always right. And then there's a small team of clinical reviewers who look at the machine outputs, and they basically do the head patting on the machine to make sure it keeps on learning, and then also tell the machine when it's getting something wrong. And then those things get published as patient cancer cards. So as a patient, you start out with the 60-second onboarding process, and then a couple maybe a couple weeks later, sometimes a couple days later, sometimes within minutes, you get a digested cancer card of your cancer story from the beginning, from all the places that you've had care. That's available to you, and then from there you can start using it in different ways. And one of the ways is to raise your hand and say, I want to try. And then things come my way, and we use an algorithm, same kind of thing, machine learning, just a lot of teaching of the computers to figure out which trials might be suitable for you and to make those reports. So as a patient, it's completely hands-off. It's a 60-second sign-up process and then raising your hand for different things you want. That's all there is to it.
And it's free, right? Doesn't cost the patient anything for them to do this. And if you as a patient are getting your records, the different hospitals are allowed to charge you. They're allowed to charge you a search fee, and then they're allowed to charge you per page. Even if they're emailing you the records, they're still allowed to charge per page, depending on the rules in whatever state you are. For here in Florida, they are allowed to charge $1 per page up to a certain amount, and then 25 cents a page thereafter. But if you go through Citizen, you don't have to pay any of those things. So just a small plug.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point too. And people can still be receiving chemotherapy and treatments right now too, and you can still get access to their records even if they're in active treatment, right? There's no status that you have to be like off of.
Yeah, I think it's really important because we can to mention that because we can always do an update. You know, if you finish a round of therapy or have kind of new progression or a new status update. It's a lot easier to do a refresh than it is to start from the beginning in building those cancer cards. So we encourage people to sign up, get everything in place, and then doing updates is not a big deal. And the other thing that's important to mention is we were talking a moment ago about informed consent, and there's this notion at Citizen, more than a notion, it's religion, of a patient's full informed consent, meaning that a patient is receiving their records into Citizen, but every use of those records is authorized by the patient. So if you're signing up to look for clinical trials, you agree to participate in that process. If your information is going to a second opinion provider, you're authorizing that. Like everything that happens with your data is your choice. And that's really important.
Yeah, I felt very comfortable with the whole process. I didn't initially answer the question of how I got involved with Citizen, but to be honest, I wasn't really looking for anything. I just met these guys because they've really gotten involved in the breast cancer community. So I kind of said, well, sure, why not? And then I, not really knowing what the impact would be, but then I realized that, wow, this would be great if I needed a second opinion. Because actually, at one point, I did need a second opinion, and it was very stressful to gather all the records, and I barely could get the records in time for the appointment. So it would have been great to have. So that was kind of what I initially did, and then I found out, wow, they had this clinical trial matching service. Again, I wasn't really looking for that, but I said, great, let's try it. Let's see what I can learn. And now I have this full report. But I have to admit, I haven't really done very much yet because it's not. I'm not really at that point yet where I need a trial. But it was really comforting to see the sheer volume, because you always feel like, oh, there aren't very many. But there were like, I don't know, like so many, like maybe, I feel like there might have been 50. I mean, I was so overwhelmed by the number and the range of types of trials. So it just made me feel really good to know, okay, like here are so many options if I ever need them. So.
Thanks, Allison. It's important to note also that some people do see 50 or more, 100 sometimes, clinical trials in their report. Just for context, we have over 700 that are fully described in our database right now. So we're working hard to cut those down for people. But then out of those 50 or 100, we always try hard to get to the 5 or so that are within your location preferences that are a full match. And that was because the first few times I delivered those big reports to people and they saw 50, they freaked out. And I needed to, I needed to figure out how to give them some markers in the road. What we don't do is recommend anything. That's like, we're not medical professionals. It's not something we would do. But we want to make sure that there are landmarks to help people navigate these reports.
Absolutely. So in our final moments here, I think if I want to do a recap and then also acknowledge if there's anything that we haven't talked about, give everyone a moment to be able to share. I feel like this hour went by incredibly quickly. But we started off talking about exactly like what is a clinical trial, what are the different phases of them, how people can get involved, and why we should get involved and start having these conversations with our oncologists and medical professionals very early on in the conversation. Because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know if the treatments that they're going to prescribe are going to either include us or preclude us or exclude us from participating. So, just now feeling empowered that we can go and start asking some of these questions is step one. Sheila, I really appreciate you bringing up the role that diversity plays in clinical trials and more that we can do to get involved. Not really pertinent to this particular conversation, but we did another podcast specifically with the NIH's program on All of Us, the research program, and trying to get 1 million people involved on not just cancer participation, all types of data. And so I think there's a lot more we can do, and we're starting to tip the needle, but there's so much more, again, to Martin, your point of the percentages of people involved, it's very little. And so if we want to have an active role, let's go forth and raise everyone up together. I love the ideas we talked about also with the consent, informed consent. I think one thing we didn't talk about was if any of these consent forms are translated into other languages, right? We're talking about some of those cultural differences or ethnic differences. If it's not in a language that they understand, how can they even give an actual conformed assent? It's not okay just to sign your name if there's something you don't know. So to ask those questions. And then the data piece and getting access to your medical information. It is your medical information. We should have access to it. I know I ask my doctors every time I go in to print things out, and similar, Abigail, I'm walking around with these binders of paper. I definitely believe that we need to move into the digital age where we can have access to this information and utilize and leverage technology. So that's just high-level recap, I think, of what we talked about and captured in this conversation. But I would like to just kind of go around our virtual room, and if there's one piece of advice that you would like to give to our listeners today, what would that advice be with regards to clinical trials or working with citizens or working with anything along your medical experience today? Allison, let's start with you.
Sure. No, I would say definitely sign up for Citizen because you have nothing to lose, and it's just kind of good planning for the future. Because you might want to have that second opinion, or you might want to enroll in a trial, and why not? It's free. But the other thing I'll say is I think you said one takeaway, but I'm going to say two. For people with triple negative breast cancer, which is what I have, I'm just putting in an extra plug for clinical trials. They're especially important for us. There's still so much that's being discovered. It's really a challenging cancer to treat, but there's so much out there in clinical trials, and that really has there's really some great life extending possibilities. So really, I think it's important for everybody, but especially if you have triple negative, please pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Abigail, what about you? Takeaway or piece of advice you'd like to leave us with today?
I think other than signing up for Citizens, because that's the obvious takeaway in terms of having everything in one place. For me anyway, I think a big piece of advice that I would give to everybody, even starting out, is to have this conversation with your doctor regularly. Even if you're doing amazing on whatever line of treatment that you're on, asking your doctor, is there anything else that I could participate in, such as the genomic trial that I was able to participate in that led me to my second line of treatment? Continually talk about that, not just with your doctor, but with your friends. I think that for those of us in the MBC community, we are talking to each other regularly, and knowing other people's experiences or being able to participate in a trial at, say, an institution that might not be local to you, having these conversations regularly, I think will only result in being able to hear about different options. Might not be exactly appropriate for you, but at least to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sheila, what about you? Thank you again for sharing your story and everything. What are your key
Oh, thank
takeaways
you.
and advice you would leave us with today?
I would just say, like Abigail was saying, just to continue to have the open conversations with your doctor about clinical trials, about your health, because this is your body, this is you. There's no right or wrong question. There's no right or wrong. It's all about you. And just continue to ask questions and ask your doctor about citizen. Well, what do you think? Have you heard of it? What do you think about a clinical trial matching? I tell my doctor everything.
Oh,
Like, I
exactly.
heard about this citizen now. Let me let you know. But
Yeah.
just continue to have those open conversations because it's so. This is your body. This is your life. And you know, um, it's important. We want to live. We want trials, and we want. This is top notch research. This is
Exactly.
excellent research that
It's
like I
exciting to
said, I've been on it for
participate, right?
2.5 years, and it's been working good. So I want that to work for everybody.
Wonderful. And I love that idea too of like passing it forward. Like you're participating now to help those later down the line who may need this in the future. So that is so humbling. And, I think the best opportunity of giving of yourself to help yourself and then help society as a whole.
Thank
Thank you. Martin, I feel like we just scratched the surface. Like 1 hour deep dive into clinical trials, how to get involved with Citizen, and where to go from here. So I'll definitely be picking your brain later so we can continue the conversation. But if there's one piece of advice or anything you want to stress to leave our listeners with today, what would it be?
Sure. Well, that diagnosis of cancer is so terrifying and so overwhelming. One of the things that I'm so impressed about is the community that exists for patients with cancer. People like, people on this call today, people even who aren't feeling well are doing everything they can to help other people because they know that they're not feeling well. And I'm moved by that. That when you're diagnosed with cancer, you're thrown in the deep end, and everything is really foreign to you. Even if you're an English speaker, and you are well educated, Yale degree, most fortunate of circumstances, it can still be overwhelming and almost impossible to understand. We're here to help. That's all. And we want to make sure that when you hit those moments where you say, I don't know what to do, or I don't know what this means, reach out. And I say that when, if you go through Citizens process and you get a match report from us, you can talk to me personally. I'm here to help. That's everybody who is diagnosed with cancer needs a hand sometimes. And that's what we're here for.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening today and for how to get more information, get involved, and for tuning in. I was just reading some of the comments as we wrap up here that this could have gone on for a whole another hour. And so, I feel like if you have questions, want to continue the conversation, I think this could be part one of many more conversations to have. So until next time, thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.